what stunned me was, the capacity of the CIA to just reach into so many aspects of American society, just the way they could pull strings. You read about the kinds of pressures that get put on people in authoritarian societies when the state begins to squeeze them. Okay? That happened to me. And when I say they had these deeply embedded ties, I mean, I felt like the life was being squeezed out of me.
Someone comes up to you at a party and says, the CIA are trying to suppress my research. You probably start backing away slowly. But if that person was my guest this week, they'd be telling the truth. I'm talking today to a living legend, Alfred McCoy, who in the early 1970s conducted research in Southeast Asia that exposed the French and American intelligence services' complicity in the global heroin trade during the Vietnam War. The CIA demanded to have a look at his research, but they couldn't find a single mistake he'd made. It was all true. For 50 years, he's maintained his steadfast commitment to uncovering the violence of empire. And now he's back with a new book called The Cold War on 5 Continents. The whole story of the Cold War that takes in the Iran coup in 1953, all the way up to the US's support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And it couldn't be a more timely topic, because it really seems like we're heading back into a second Cold War. And the parallels are quite eerie. One of the major events of the first Cold War was the Suez Crisis. In that crisis, waning global powers invaded a Middle Eastern country, failed to depose its leader, and didn't secure control of a vital global shipping lane because the middle power blocked it off. Those countries were chastened and their ability to project global power was tarnished forever. In that case, it was Britain, France, and Israel attacking Egypt, but we might one day be telling the same story about the effects of the war on Iran. So, are we back in a new Cold War? And what can we learn from the history of covert operations, if indeed we are? We're still making our map of everything that has ever mattered, and our guest this week has seen a lot of things that really mattered. Alfred McCoy, welcome to Your Own Research. You wrote a book which was published in 1972 called The Politics of Heroin. And I just wanted to see if you could explain what exactly happened in that book and how it relates to this new book that we're talking about, Cold War on 5 Continents. What did you uncover in Southeast Asia?
In 1972, I did a book on the heroin epidemic among U.S. troops fighting in South Vietnam. A later White House survey done very scientifically of 1,000 returning veterans who served in Vietnam in 1971, the year I did my research there, determined that 34%, 1/3 of all the U.S. combat forces fighting in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War were regular heroin users. In other words, heroin addicts. There were probably, the numbers are a bit imprecise, but there were probably more heroin users inside the U.S. Army in South Vietnam than there were in the continental United States. And for me, the question was, where was the heroin coming from? How did this drug almost sort of miraculously appear overnight to foster an epidemic that swept through the ranks of the U.S. military? And so I got an advance from a New York publisher, then Harper & Row, today HarperCollins, major corporate publisher. And I went around the world 1.5 times exploring this project. Now, up to this time, I'd spent my whole life, because if you step out of school, you get drafted. So I'd spent my entire life, first in boarding school, then in undergraduate at Columbia University, and then as a graduate student, basically at Carroll in the Gothic Tower of Sterling Memorial Library at Yale University. And so this was sort of my first experience of the real world, and particularly the world of covert operations. And in the course of my travels, I met 4 of the, and indirectly 5 of the major and most famous covert operatives of the Cold War era. at the time, I was traveling so far and so fast, hopscotching across the United States, interviewing people, then to Okinawa, down to Hong Kong, probing the sort of back alleys of Hong Kong, interviewing British colonial narcotics police, then to Saigon, where I interviewed the former Director General of the South Vietnamese Police, then up into the mountains of Laos, hiked up into the mountains, the edge of the Free Fire Zone, did an opium survey among villages, survived a CIA ambush that tried to kill me and my research team, went on to Marseille, Paris, etc., back to the United States. Okay, and in this circuit around the globe, I was bombarded with sensations. Now, at the time when I met these covert operatives, I basically mined these interviews for the simple verities of time, person, and place. And I put that in my first book, The Politics of Heroin, which was an exploration of the global drug trade, and particularly the traffic in Southeast Asia, the so-called Golden Triangle region, and explaining how the drugs were produced in the Golden Triangle, how they were smuggled to South Vietnam, and how they were distributed to the GIs near the fire-based barracks and bar in South Vietnam. I think back then I was traveling so far and so fast that my mind was simply overwhelmed by the sights and sounds that just bombarded my senses. Moreover, when I encountered these covert operatives, I think I was overwhelmed by a mix of fear or fascination or both. And I think my interview with one of the most famous and consequential, a man named Colonel Roger Trinquier. Roger Trinquier was head of Highland Hill Tribe operations during the French Indochina War in the early 1950s. He later went on to Algeria, where he was a key operative in the Battle of Algiers, torturing and executing about 3,000 people. He later commanded an area in northern Algiers where he basically invented what became a strategic hamlet in South Vietnam. And then he wrote a tactical treatise on counterinsurgency that was fundamental for the U.S. strategy in fighting the Vietnam War. So I called up Roger Trinquier and arranged an interview, and I met him in his Paris, and we spent about 3 hours. I was seated comfortably at a table and with my notebook, and he was telling me about his time in Indochina. And he was explaining to me how, in order to finance his covert operations, he had his paratroopers collect the opium from the Hmong villagers in northern Indochina. He requisitioned aircraft, flew it down to a secret air base in Cap Jong near Saigon, and then delivered it to the Sino-Vietnamese mafia that did the drug distribution in the city. And on the surface, this interview seemed very civil. I was sipping tea, taking notes. He was chatting away. And yet, this was no ordinary man. This was Roger Trinquier. And somehow, I cannot describe it, he extended his penumbra of power over me. He somehow began psychologically dominating. And it turned into kind of an interrogation that he was running. And he drained the energy from me so that by the time I finished what was on the surface this very civil 3-hour encounter, I almost stumbled out of his apartment. I was utterly exhausted. And it was like his fingers had gone up into my nose and swept the lobes of my brain. I cannot describe it. So when I set out about 5 years ago to first teach a course on the Cold War to undergraduates at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I teach, and I began writing up the notes, and then I moved beyond that to produce the book. It was really curious the way. I don't understand the way my mind works. I don't get it. But something happened from the past. These experiences that I'd apparently been processing for a long time, unconsciously, sort of returned. And these characters that I'd interviewed 50 years before now emerged from my consciousness and began to sort of shape the structure of the narrative that I was writing. And I was now dealing with them not in terms of time, person, and place, but that fourth dimension of them as consequential historical actors. And from the documents scattered across my desk and my computer screen, about 30 of these characters arose. They're in the appendix to my book. And they began to shape my narrative. And they began to inform the way I perceived the Cold War. And it was this curious conflict or clash between that past of 50 years ago and my present that actually shaped the writing of this book. And therefore, in the book, what I do is there's been a tremendous amount written during the last decades about covert operations during the Cold War. But what I did, I think, was something different. What I argued was, first of all, that the Cold War, in order to understand its long-term impact, we need to move beyond the Washington-Moscow dialogue. We need to decenter the Cold War, not worry about it's very important, I know, about the nuclear or thermonuclear war that never happened. But let's look about the wars, the regional wars that did happen, that in some produced about 20 million deaths, making the Cold War the second most violent war in the history of humankind. So what I became concerned with was these disparate, scattered regional conflicts that produced tremendous mortality and that also left a profound legacy of conflict and trauma, collective trauma in the subject societies that persists in many regions of the world right up to the present day. And so I was moving the Cold War from the centers of empire to the periphery, and therefore writing a history that was outside in and bottom up, if you will. All right. And what I argued was that these covert actors, and I borrowed a term from British imperial history called the man on the spot, and they're very well known in British history. There's this conundrum. London had a formal policy in the late 19th, early 20th century of non-expansion, and yet the British Empire expanded to cover, in terms of direct colonial rule, about a quarter of the globe. So how did non-expansion become expansion? And one of the explanations is there was this recurrence of the man on the spot, the individual adventurer or official who unilaterally takes action to extend the British Empire. All the way starting from James Brooke in 1838, he sails into Kuching Harbor in Sarawak and establishes a family dynasty, the Brooke family dynasty, the White Rajahs of Borneo, that lasts until 1940, a little over 100 years. And there's many of them. The most famous is Lawrence of Arabia. These individual actors that extend the reach of the British Empire to whole new terrains and thus expand the empire. And so borrowing that term, I argued that these were not just covert operatives, but these were latter-day men on the spot. Just as the rise of British Empire had created geopolitical opportunities for the British men on the spot, so the process of decolonization after World War II created a parallel opportunity. And that brings in a second key dimension of my work, is the geopolitical dimension. Now, if you ask most historians today, whether individuals, no matter who they might be, generals, kings, emperors, presidents, prime ministers, the argument is that weighing that up against the deeper, longer forces of economic and ecological change, individuals do not make much of a difference. Individuals do not make history. And yet I was dealing with this cast of characters, these men on the spot, who did seem to have the individual power, the autonomy to shape history. And so that raised the question, how could this happen? And so what I realized was that, unlike most historians that treat decolonization as kind of a coda to the 19th century age of empires, and think that it's largely over by the 1970s, what I did is I re-examined decolonization just back of the envelope, and realized that no, it started in 1946 with the U.S. liberation of the Philippines. It ended in 1994 with the end of apartheid in South Africa. And indeed, throughout the 1980s, there was a struggle for basically the southern half of Africa, not a small territory. So the process of decolonization, 1946 to 1994, coincides exactly with the Cold War, 1947, 1991. And it's this coincidence of the Cold War and decolonization in these far-flung imperial battlegrounds that create ruptures in the world system, in which there's a kind of void as there's a transition from European empire to new nation state and rival empires, Soviet and American, competing for the territory. And this arenas become momentarily detached from the ambit of world power. And in this geopolitical void, the men on the spot have the autonomy to actually shape history and make history happen. First half of the Cold War, that was, I think, an important perspective, an important, perhaps new way of looking at the conduct of the Cold War.
I hope you're enjoying today's episode. Just got a bit of a request. Novara Media has launched its audience survey, and getting your feedback is really important to us. Understanding who watches our content and what issues matter to you is crucial for helping us grow and make new products like the one you're currently watching. Do your own research. We're preparing to take our biggest leap yet, and your feedback will be essential to that. And if you fancy winning one of 5 £50 vouchers for our merch shop, fill it in by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, the 12th of April, to be in with a shot of winning one of those prizes. Your feedback really matters to us. So go to novara.media/survey and fill it in while you're watching this episode. And now back to Alfred McCoy. I want to go back to what these covert operatives were doing in your first book, In the Politics of Heroin, because you kind of went over it quite quickly there. What was the role of the operatives who you were speaking to in Vietnam, in Laos? Like, how are they actually using their covert operations in order to do things that were useful for American empire? Were they using the drug trade to fund covert operations, or is the connection more obscure or less direct than that?
Well, if we talk about Vietnam, we can talk about the drugs, but more broadly, we need to talk about covert operations, okay? All right, very simply, during the first Indochina War, the French war effort, which is 1946 to 1954, the French war effort, because of the crisis of the Third Republic, the post-war reconstruction of France being occupied, et cetera, and having been a battleground in the war, meant that the French state was badly funded. This was a very costly colonial enterprise. The United States, by the end of the French Indochina War, was paying for about 80%. That meant that covert operations had to basically fund themselves. And so the way the French funded their covert operations during the First Indochina War was, as I explained earlier a little bit, that they collected the opium. Let me wind back, okay? From the 1860s through the 1950, the French ran an opium monopoly like most colonial powers in Southeast Asia, and it accounted for a significant portion of their colonial revenues, about a high of about 20%. It was in some of the British Malay colonies that the opium accounted for as high as 50% of colonial revenues, okay? Well, as a result of the UN's abolition of legal drug trading, the French, seeking legitimacy for their new state, abolished opium, and it moved from the open books of the French colonial exchequer into the black books of French intelligence. The French intelligence took it over. So what would happen was the paratroopers under Colonel Roger, or then Major Roger Tranquier, would collect the opium from the opium-producing minorities in the mountains of the north of Laos and northern Tonkin. And they would fly it down on a secret requisition of an aircraft near Saigon. They would distribute it to the opium dens in Saigon through a Sino-Vietnamese mafia called the Binh Xuyen Bandits that that ran and protected Saigon from communist infiltration from their opium profits. There was a very close complementation between French covert operations and the opium traffic during the First Indochina War. And I know this because I interviewed the head of General Maurice Bayeux, who was the head of HDEC, which was the French intelligence unit in Indochina, and he told me expressly how he did it. And I then interviewed Tranquet, whose troops collected the opium, and he told me expressly in detail how he did it, and he later published an article detailing it. And there was no doubt about that, right? Now, when the Americans came in, the CIA was not underfunded, all right? But nonetheless, if you will, the kind of structure of the political economy of Indochina, particularly the covert dimensions of that political economy, hadn't changed particularly. So when the United States got involved in Laos in covert operations starting in about 1961, the United States mobilized the largest highland minority, who were natural guerrilla fighters, the Hmong people, then called Mao. The Hmong had a very simple economy. They grew highland sticky rice for subsistence, and they grew opium for cash crop to buy everything non-farm, non-locally produced. And as the war spread by 1963-64, the normal caravan trade that had moved through the mountains of Laos collecting the opium from the tribes was disrupted. The bombing started in 1964, the fighting spread, and that meant that the only transport in and out of the villages that were on the side of the CIA, providing manpower for a 30,000 strong CIA secret army called Armée Clandestine, that's what they called it, were the aircraft and helicopters, flying the manpower out of the villages to the CIA headquarters at Longcheng, and they began flying the opium out of the villages as well. And then in 1970, when the U.S. Army in South Vietnam decided to crack down on marijuana use, and marijuana, because of its pungent smell, was readily detected, and that was a very effective extirpation. Then the heroin appeared, and the commander-in-chief of the Royal Laotian Army, Commander General Radicone, opened the largest heroin lab in Southeast Asia that produced a brand called WO Glow brand. And he requisitioned aircraft from the Lao Air Force. And so they flew the opium across the mountains into South Vietnam, where military syndicates in South Vietnam distributed to troops fighting in South Vietnam in 1971, 72. And that was how the traffic operated. Now, there's an important continuity. The opium's moving, from Laos to Vietnam. That continues, but there's a distinction. The French intelligence ran the trade directly, right? Because they needed the finances and the profits from it. And the French officers were quite explicit about that. The CIA didn't need the money, not at all. But they were mobilizing a people, probably about a community of over 100,000 people, who were providing soldiers for them. That operation continued for 15 years. And so, given the high casualty rates, there were about 9,000 seriously wounded and killed. And the cohort in any given year, the generation cohort available to the among was about 20 to 30,000 young males a year. So those were very high casualties. They had to constantly renew their recruitment from the villages. So they had to sustain the village economy. They had to keep the people alive. And they dropped rice to all the villages that were providing them troops, but that was only a part of the income of the villages. The villages were still producing opium and still needed access to market. And so the CIA was turning a blind eye to the traffic because that was the economic foundation for the Hmong among communities and their capacity to continue to supply the soldier that the CIA needed to fight the secret war in Laos.
You're talking about it as a secret operation, a covert operation, and a secret war. But when you actually speak to the French officers, they are extremely open about exactly what it is they are doing. I wonder if it was just a different time. I can't really imagine asking a covert operative now what they are doing and having them explain to me in such rich detail exactly how the entire system works. How do you kind of account for that? Or is it just you think that perhaps journalists have lost some of that gumption that they required in order to ask those direct questions?
Good question. Why did they all talk so frankly? My feeling was that the veterans of the Indochina War were dealing with fundamental fact of defeat. They lost, and they lost badly. They were defeated in battles at Dien Bien Phu. It was a major humiliation for them. They lost their colony of Indochina. The Americans expelled them. I think there was a certain bitterness, individually and collectively, about their experience. And so maybe they're trying to explain it themselves. Maybe they were just simply doing what old men often do. They just want to tell their story. I found as an historian that wherever the culture is, when you get and it may be true for women, but in the era we're talking about, it was males that had power, particularly in this covert world of the Cold War. It's almost all male. So when you sit down with elderly men who are retired and often have time on their hands, they want to tell their stories, and they don't really care what you think about it, and they're not. There's no reason for them to lie. They're not going anywhere. They're not vying for promotion. They're not facing consequences. I think they have a commitment to leaving a legacy of truth. They want people to understand what they did and why they did it. And I found this, whether I'm interviewing elderly sugar workers and union leaders in the Central Philippines. I did a book on a graduating class from the Philippine Military Academy. It was all based on oral histories. And I got them about 50 years after their graduation in the 1990s, class of 1940. And they all agreed to be interviewed, and they all told their stories with amazing frankness. And I found that with American covert operatives, Lucian Conan, Lansdale, everybody Lansdale, no, Lansdale, no. He was always quite manipulative. He didn't tell me much, but his offsider, Lucian Conan, he talked frankly. So if you can get to them and find them and sit down with them and you're generally interested in what they have to say, they're very interesting conversations, very, very interesting conversations. And my greatest talent, I've always found, is the gift of asking the wrong question. Because when you ask the wrong question, you say something that's stupid. Then they have to educate you, and they have to sit down. They really explain it. No, it wasn't that way. It was this way. So I found some amazing things that way. Okay, good heavens! When I sat down with the head of the class in 1940, in the Philippine Military Academy, one of the mysteries of the Philippines, this is very much off topic, but not so much, was, before Marcos declared martial law, Ferdinand Marcos declared martial law in Manila in 1972, there were 20 bombing that went off, blew up a major pipe in the water system, blew up the floor of a department store and killed a dozen people. These were terror bombings, okay? And I asked some inept question, and the guy corrected me and said, "Oh, no, that was when my brother-in-law was setting off bombs for Marcos." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Oh, well, my brother-in-law, named General so-and-so, he was doing forward operations for Marcos, setting off the bombs. He was the one that was blowing up things around Manila, in order to create the climate that was conducive for the suspension of democracy and the declaration of martial law in 1972. Just extraordinary. And then when we left, his wife, it was a Sunday, and his wife, as middle-class women in Manila often do, they're playing mahjong on a Sunday afternoon. Go to church in the morning, mahjong in the afternoon. And he introduced me to the general's wife, who was, of course, sitting there playing mahjong with his wife. It was bizarre. Okay, so yes, it's if you can find the people, get to them, and they're retired and they're in the mood, they will talk frankly. Or Lucien Conein was one of them. Lucien Conein was a very famous covert operative. He was one of the ones that I met. He was born in France, raised in the United States. He parachuted into northern China at the end of World War II and trained the Viet Minh, the communist forces, in guerrilla warfare tactics in the war. When the U.S. intervened in Vietnam in 1954-55, Edward Lansdale, the quiet American, did so famously. His outsider was Lucien Conein. And in that operation, Lansdale, acting as one of my men on the spot, installed Ngo Dinh Diem as prime minister, later president of South Vietnam. And that was 1955. By 1963, Diem had proved himself to be an inept leader, a brutal autocrat, had about 50,000 people jailed in prisons there. The communist revolt had revived. The Viet Cong was formed in the countryside. In January of 1963, the Viet Cong scored a surprising victory over a major force of South Vietnamese who had U.S. helicopters, making them air mobile, had U.S. armored personnel carriers, giving them enormous force. And the Viet Cong shot this attack to pieces, and that signaled to the United States that Diem was inept. And then the U.S. ambassador, Harry Cavalage, decided to overthrow Diem and turn to Lucien Conein, who was the man that organized the coup. And this was an example. Not only did Conein organize the coup among the South Vietnamese military that overthrew Diem, but during the deliberations of the coup group, when Diem had surrendered to them, the question is what to do with them. And they thought, the generals thought they could fly him off into exile. And basically Conein told them, were you stupid? You don't have a plane to take him, and you don't have a country who has agreed to accept him, So you can't do that. So the generals instead sent an assassin and killed Diem and his brother and left them dead, bleeding in the streets of Saigon. So in terms of the U.S. involvement in South Vietnam, both General Lansdale in 1955 in installing Diem as America's surrogate, and Lucien Conein in 1963 as assassinating that same surrogate, plunging South Vietnam into absolute instability, with the Viet Cong advancing in the countryside. That led, of course, to the U.S. intervention by its conventional military forces, starting in 1965. And so these two men on the spot in the history of the Vietnam War were incredibly consequential. Lansdale for having created a client state and identified a loyal American surrogate to create a regime the United States could back, and Conein by overthrowing that same government. So these two men played an enormously consequential role in basically immersing the United States in the Vietnam quagmire. And Lansdale, in his general style of operations, he arrives in a country as an individual CI operative, and as they have to do, he starts looking for local allies, because after all, his capacity to maneuver and manipulate the Philippines, where he was from 1950 to 53, or Vietnam in 1934, 55, all depends on the identification of local assets. They're the fulcrum that allows him to lift the country in the desired direction. Or in the Philippines, he found Ramon Magsaysay, defense minister, future president. Lansdale ran the campaign that made Magsaysay his surrogate into the president of the Philippines. In Vietnam, he did the same. And so Lansdale always reached out for large networks of the local population, local influentials. And he was very skilled at that. And so in this case, when Lansdale got to Saigon in 1954, he started looking around for the violence. Lansdale was utterly inept in foreign languages. The language of the military that he was trying to maneuver and manipulate in Saigon in 1954-55 was French. But Lansdale had flunked out of UCLA because he couldn't pass French. America's most famous covert operative overseas was utterly inept when it came to learning foreign languages, which you'd think would be the basic stock and trade of a foreign covert operative. Lansdale couldn't do it. Anyway, so he arrived in Saigon, not speaking French, not speaking Vietnamese, and knowing nothing about South Vietnam. And he began looking for recruits and allies, and he found Ngo Dinh Diem, of course. We've talked about that. But he also found a man named Phan Xuan An, who was a young, apparently up-and-coming Vietnamese. He met him in the Army headquarters. He began teaching him intelligence, tradecraft, a man named Phan Xuan An. And then Lansdale liked him so much that the CIA had about 170 foundations that they ran to basically launder their money, to move covert money into civil society organizations. So Lansdale arranged for the CIA Front Foundation, the Asia Foundation, to provide Phan Xuan An a scholarship. And with travel money from the Communist Party, because Phan Xuan An was a member of the Vietnamese Communist Party, and a scholarship from the Asia Foundation, Phan Xuan An went to the United States and, mastered his English, began to understand Americans and American culture. And when he came back, he began working. He did his degree in journalism at Orange Coast Community College near Los Angeles. When he got back to Saigon, he first of all worked in the intelligence service of the South Vietnamese government, and then he moved into becoming a journalist. And by the time the war was over, he was Time Magazine's last bureau chief in Saigon. And he was a superb agent. He operated alone, and he would never hold purloined documents. He would get them, and then he would read them, and he would type up reports, and then he would photograph the reports on exposed film and give the exposed film to a courier. So if the courier was caught, all the courier had to do was pull the reel of film and expose it to sunlight, and then the report was wiped. Very clever method. And he had couriers that would carry it across South Vietnam to the border area and then to Phnom Penh, and it would be flown to Hanoi. And he did about 480 reports. And when the war was over, and he retired from Time Magazine as bureau chief of Saigon, he was given 16 medals by the Vietnamese government, the Communist government of Vietnam, one for each of his major victories that he played a critical role in. And the photograph there on your map, that's him in his uniform as a general in the People's Army of Vietnam. Right. And so, Phan Xuan An learned all kinds of intelligence tradecraft from Lansdale. Lansdale had no idea who he was training, but he was training basically a man who became Hanoi's man on the spot in Saigon during the Vietnam War. And Phan Xuan An's role in all of North Vietnam's major military victories was very important. That battle I mentioned, Ap Bac, okay? Phan Xuan An was the one that warned the Viet Cong unit that they were about to be attacked so they could dig defenses and prepare for an assault and destroy that armada of helicopters and armored personnel carriers that were attacking a small Viet Cong unit of about 200 men and inflict a stinging defeat on the South Vietnamese army. The famous Tet Offensive of 1968, the head of Viet Cong intelligence came into Saigon for a couple of months, and Phan Xuan An drove him around the city, picking all the targets, not just for military vulnerability, but for psychological impact. And indeed, the Tet Offensive had a profound psychological impact. The U.S. won that offensive militarily. We killed 58,000 of the 80,000 attackers. It was a clear U.S. military victory, but it was a huge propaganda defeat, in part because of the attack, for example, on the grounds of the U.S. Embassy, which Van Swan had picked as a prime target. And in the final battle for Vietnam, Van Swan picked the highland city of Ban Me Thuot as being particularly vulnerable militarily. And so the North Vietnamese attacked Ban Me Thuot, and in one day they captured the town, and they panicked the South Vietnamese government. So the president of South Vietnam, Nguyen Van Thieu, withdrew his army from the northern half of the country. That withdrawal became a rout that spread panic through the army and led to collapse. And he also, Francois Hollande, also wrote a report assuring Hanoi that they could attack full-blown against South Vietnam and that the Americans would not come back. So he was important, not just for the information he found out about when offensives would take place, but he was also important because, thanks to Lansdale, he'd been to America, he rather liked, and he understood Americans quite well. And so he could interpret the raw information and could write about it in Vietnamese in a way that his superiors in Hanoi would understand the import of what he was saying, what the meaning of these documents were that he was purloining and delivering to them.
Van Sam is the person who, in some ways, is the culmination of a kind of period of covert operations from the Americans, which seems to gather a kind of hubristic sense that they can dominate not just the battlefield, but also the intelligence landscape. And Francois Nam, who's this extraordinary Vietnamese spy, is the sort of culmination of that hubris, because he defeats it and makes it evident that actually the people who are being attacked by the Americans in various ways are also perfectly capable of doing their own kinds of intelligence work. And I want to trace that a bit further through Edward Lansdale's career.
Could I just pick up there? What I'm trying to say is, in the book, is that not only these men are on the spot influential, indeed, in some areas, they're transformative as intelligence operatives. Right? What I'm saying is that this netherworld of intelligence is during the Cold War, because the way it's fought. The superpowers have achieved mutually assured destruction with their nuclear weapons. They can't confront each other directly, so they engage in each other obliquely through covert operations, right? And so what I'm saying is that this is a prime arena for contestation during the Cold War. And during the Vietnam War, okay, it's always amazed me how historians avoid the big question. And there's a very large question that historians, it's too large for American historians, maybe too painful to ask or answer. It's very simply, why did the United States lose the Vietnam War? And now, and it's further complicated by the simple fact that when you look at the conventional combat, the United States won every major battle. We lost a couple, but we won all the battles that really mattered, including Tet, right? And yet we lost the war. So how can you win every battle when there's a war? And the answer, and this is what I argue in the book, is that we won the conventional war, but we lost the underground war. We lost the intelligence, because Francois Hollande was just one of what the head of order and battle intelligence for the CIA, a man named Sam Adams, who published an article in Harper's Magazine on this. He calculated from his research, classified research, that there were 30,000 Vietnamese spies honeycombing the South Vietnamese government and army. And he said that this was the biggest intelligence operation in the history of intelligence. During the Cold War, whenever Soviet counterintelligence met the CIA intelligence, they won, we lost, okay? So in South Vietnam, the CIA mounted a major operation fighting the underground war. And they organized something called the Phoenix Program that was responsible for 41,000 extrajudicial executions, all right? And they had an interrogation center, a provincial interrogation center, in almost every one of the 40 plus provinces of South Vietnam. And in that interrogation center, they had something called Provincial Reconnaissance Unit, who were branded, they were tattooed in their upper arms with the words Satcom, kill commies, okay? So they were branded killers. And the CIA had a national interrogation center in Saigon, a big bank of IBM computers, and they were collecting this data. They were sending it out to the provincial interrogation centers across the country. And these provincial reconnaissance units were going out, rounding up suspected communists, bringing them in for torture and for execution. And 41,000 suspects, communist suspects, were killed. All right. In this report by Sam Adams, the CIA did, he reported that some Phoenix units had been taken over by the Viet Cong. They penetrated. In other words, they flipped the massive U.S. intelligence program through effective communist counterintelligence. And through the accidents of personal acquaintance, I figured this out. And this is something, speaking of pure hubris, Americans have never realized that how badly we lost this underground war. It's kind of, it's people talk about it, whether it was bad, immoral, but there's not a recognition of the role that it likely played in the U.S. defeat in South Vietnam. And this is how I figured this out, okay? When I was in boarding school, I was on the wrestling team with a guy named John Merson, who dropped out of Amherst College, joined the U.S. Marine Corps, and wound up in the northern part of Vietnam. And the Marines had a structure of highly autonomous small squads that were operating almost independently in the villages, winning hearts and minds of villagers and fighting the Viet Cong. And Merson in 2008 wrote a memoir of his service in I Corps in northern Vietnam. And he said they got intelligence one day of a Viet Cong unit coming down a river in sampans, basically dugout canoes, and at a certain time and place. And so his Marine squad, in the dark, set up a killing zone at the time and place where the Viet Cong squad was going to be passing through. And he said they created a killing zone. They opened up and they killed everybody. And then they turned on the lights. There were no soldiers. There were no guns. They were all women and children and old men. They'd massacred innocent civilians. And his unit was so repulsed, so horrified by what they'd done, that every soldier had a 12-month contract. They just hid in the villages. They would not fight anymore, because they were so demoralized. So Merson sent me this manuscript before he published it. He's published it. You can find it online. I think it's called War Story by John Merson in the RSON. And he sent me this because he heard I was teaching a course at the University of Wisconsin. I might find some errors in the manuscript. I read it and I got to that passage at about page 162, I think it was. And I was just shocked at this guy, who I knew and admired, an upperclassman, a really good wrestler, captain of the wrestling team, a fine human being, had this happen to him. Right? And so at Christmas time, my family got together, and my stepfather was a retired U.S. Marine Corps colonel, and his last assignment before his retirement, he was a deputy chief of intelligence in the Military Assistance Command Vietnam headquarters. He was General Westmoreland's deputy chief of intelligence. And so I told Professor, who was a career Marine officer, about what had happened to one of his fellow Marines. And when it was, as soon as I finished, he said at me, just shut right back at me. He said, "Good counterintelligence by the enemy." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, villagers hate Americans, Marines demoralized, win-win for the enemy. Just like that. And then I thought, of course, Merson's Marines have been manipulated. And if they could do that, and by the way, John Merson's a very smart guy. He later went to Harvard Business School. He became an innovator at IBM, a very smart man, okay? And if they could manipulate Merson or his Marines, what could the real, and this was a Viet Cong militia unit way out in the countryside, what could the real intelligence specialists in Saigon be doing to the U.S. command? How could they be manipulating the whole Phoenix program? And what I began to realize is that it's very likely that Vietnamese intelligence did what British intelligence did during World War II under Masterman and the double cross system with they knew all the Germans that were in the United Kingdom. instead of arresting them and throwing them in jail, they just fed them bad information as their pipeline into German intelligence in Berlin. That's what counterintelligence always does, right? Counterintelligence flips the enemy intelligence apparatus to serve their aims. And that's what the Vietnamese did in South Vietnam. And speaking of imperial hubris, as far as I know, I am the only person who presumes to make this argument. There is this blindness in this country that this massive, morally questionable CIA program was not only engaged in extrajudicial killings, which are essentially a war crime, but it was inept and it was counterproductive. And we were killing some of our own allies. In fact, probably lots of our own allies. And so this was one of the ways that this underground war, this espionage, and these men on the spot really shaped the history of the Cold War.
And yet the covert operations continue a great deal, right? They are as you're saying, the kind of the bedrock of it. And I wonder if we've talked about the kind of the thermonuclear threat and the way in which that pushes the Cold War essentially sort of underground to be in this kind of covert space. But there's also a sense that you write about in your other book that I've read, To Govern the Globe, when each new world order produces its own sort of moral architecture. And in the era of the Cold War, the moral architecture is against colonialism. The US at various times, at least rhetorically, an anti-colonial power. And I wonder if you could speak to that sort of sense of having to push the real acts of colonization or the real acts of brutality underground or into the secret world because of this moral architecture, even if in many cases, such as the Vietnam War, there are these very open, acts of war crimes, as you're saying.
Sure. After World War II, the United States was two things. One, we were creating, in cooperation with our allies, particularly Great Britain, a new world order, all right, that was trying to deal with all of the economic and political problems that had bedeviled the old world order. And so at two major conferences in the closing months of World War II, in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, there was a major conference in which representatives of the Allied nations and non-combatant nations that was independent gathered together, and they designed the architecture for a new world economic order. They established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They set the dollar as the global reserve currency, convertible to gold, or I think at $35 an ounce, right? And they were, in doing this, they were attempting to remove the crippling effect of the Great Depression. They were essentially, John Maynard Keynes was in attendance representing the United Kingdom, and this was kind of the globalization of Keynesian economics, right? And it created the global economic structure in which we live today, right? And it was very successful. And a follow-up conference created the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, which later became in the 1990s the World Trade Organization. That was one aspect. The other conference was at San Francisco in 1945, and that conference created the United Nations, which essentially had two organizing principles: that all human beings had universal human rights, and all human beings had the right to their own sovereign nation, and those sovereign nations would be freed from any transgression, military transgression. The right of conquest of territory by force of arms was abjured by the members of the United Nations. You can no longer do that. So basically, every human being had a nation, and every nation had inviolable sovereignty. Those are the two core principles of the United Nations. The United States was not only the architecture of a very idealistic world system, but it was also succeeding Britain and becoming the world's great hegemon. In fact, an empire of absolutely unprecedented military and economic power. At the close of World War II and up to about 1950, the United States had, it's estimated, about 50% of the world's sort of gross world output. Okay, 50% of economic productivity on the planet was done in the United States. And we had a massive military. We were a global hegemon in which there was an asymmetry of power between us and the second tier powers, unlike anything that ever existed before in human history. Right? Now, the question is, how does the global hegemon exercise this hegemony, which requires intervention in foreign countries, right? When you've just created an international architecture that guarantees all of the nations of the world inviolable sovereignty. So how do you violate inviolable sovereignty without making complete mockery of your world order? Well, the answer to do it is to do it covertly. And not just covertly, but there was a second principle that the United States had, not only covert operations, but they all had to be conducted with what was called plausible deniability, which meant that if the operation came undone and somebody were captured, we could simply say, they're not our guy, we weren't doing this, we were not violating sovereignty, or we were not challenging the Soviet Union, ratcheting up the tensions that might lead to thermonuclear war. So that was the if you will, the CIA and covert operations from an American perspective were a way of resolving what I call the contradiction that lay at the heart of the post-World War II international order that the United States constructed.
And there is this also in the homeland as well, in the US itself, there is this attempt to transform the culture of the United States in order to give some sort of like hegemonic kind of backing to this. And I wanted to come over here to someone who we talk about, in your book, was Cord Meyer. And he's a person who has a run-in with another person you can see on the map here, who will be familiar to everyone here, which is, of course, you. What relationship do you have with Cord Meyer? And what does he try to do to your book we were talking about at the very beginning, The Politics of Heroin?
Well, I'm back to the first part of your comment and then come to it. Okay. Look, as a part of the global competition with the Soviet Union over ideas, the Cold War was ultimately a war of ideas between not just two rival empires, which was part of it, but also two rival world systems with fundamental values: democracy and capitalism on one side, and socialism and proletarian regimes or autocracy on the other, right? And there was a serious and sustained ideological battle in the first 2 decades of the Cold War, particularly as nations were emerging from colonial rule and were constructing their social orders. There was an attraction for socialism in the Third World because colonial capitalism had been so predatory. So there was a serious ideological battle taking place. Now, the Soviet Union was a command economy, and already all of the creative classes inside the Soviet Union and its satellite states were organized into the Union of Writers and the Union of Scientists, and every individual, every aspect of every individual's life was organized. Young pioneers, women's organizations. So for the Soviet Union to mobilize its creative classes for the Cold War was intuitive and inherent in the system that they created. But in the United States, there is this idea of individualism and the limits of state power, right? So the United States couldn't mobilize its creative classes directly because that would seem to be a violation of the individualism that we stood for, the individualism and the freedom. And so the question is, again, how do you mobilize your creative classes when you can't seem to be mobilizing your creative classes? You do it covertly. And one of the things I did in the book was I went into the literature, and there's been a lot of research in the United States of the CIA's penetration of an amazing array of individual fields. But nobody had ever really pulled it all together. And so what I tried to do in this chapter was go through this literature, and I was familiar with some of it myself because I'd done some of this research, but and then pull it all together. And what I can say is this, is that right from the start of the Cold War, there was this systematic mobilization of America's creative classes in a surprisingly broad range of fields: film, journalism, symphony music, painting, abstract expressionism was deployed internationally as the answer to Soviet socialist realism. they were practicing this old style literal art, and we were probing the limits of human consciousness and creativity with this new thing, abstract expressionists, people like Jackson Pollock and Mark and Rothko, and it was this total mobilization. And the man who ran the media for the CIA was Cord Meyer Jr. He'd started off during World War II as a Marine, and he wrote dispatches from battles in the Pacific, published in leading literary magazines in the Atlantic, in the United States. And then he was president at San Francisco. He was an aide in the drafting of the UN Charter, and then he formed an organization called United World Federalists, which had the idea that the way to avoid nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States, indeed to avoid all future wars, was to have a unified world government, not just a UN of constituent member states, but to go beyond that. And then, about 1950, he joined the CIA, and he disappeared for good heavens, 15 years. And during that period, the CIA ran an amazing operation of controlling the American press and publishing. It was once estimated that the CIA had about 400 journalists on the payroll, including New York Times reporters. The New York Times did an investigation and found no, that wasn't accurate. It's more like 800 journalists were on the CIA's payroll, right? And the CIA was planning stories internationally and planning stories domestically to create a climate to support their operations. And the domestic operations were, of course, a violation of the CIA's charter. Okay. So Cord Meyer Jr. was one of the most influential people in the United States because he was running this operation. The other thing they did, by the way, is the socialists were big on youth. They had youth organizations, youth conferences, student groups, right? And so there was something called the National Student Association, NSA, that had chapters on every campus across the United States. They're all CIA funded, CIA controlled. And Cord Meyer ran those as well. So, he had this enormous amount of power. At 1971, when I started investigating the drug trade, I survived that ambush in Laos, got back to the United States and started writing. And then in 1972, when I was about to publish, I went to Washington, D.C. and testified in front of a congressional committee. And then Cord Meyer Jr. popped up in my publisher's office. And the CIA very famously, rather like MI6 in his day, recruited from elite families and elite colleges. Cord Meyer had gone to Yale, and there were a lot of Yaleys in the CIA. He was from the New York social elite. There was something called the Social Register of the 400 New York families. He was in it along with Cass Canfield Sr., my publisher, the owner of then Harper & Row, which Murdoch brought out to make HarperCollins. Mr. Cass Canfield Sr., as it turned out, was also on the board of several of those CIA front foundations. They needed to have reliable people on the board of directors who would, sign off on the bogus books that the CIA were using to launder money from secret accounts into public civil society organizations. So Cass Canfield Sr. was a CIA asset. Cord Meyer Jr., an old personal friend. They were both in the New York Social Register. Families had known each other a long time, and so Cord Meyer Jr. turned up and asked Mr. Canfield if he wouldn't mind suppressing my book. Mr. Canfield said that, they actually couldn't do that, but he didn't actually say this, but in violation of the Constitution, he would agree to give the CIA prior review of my manuscript. And so I was called down from Yale, took the train down, and I had an interview with the legal counsel and president of Harper & Row telling me that I would turn my book over to the CIA or it wouldn't be published. And fortunately, I happen to know the most famous investigative reporter of the era, a man named Seymour Hersh, who was working for the New York Times. So I agreed to have the CIA review my manuscript. I didn't have any choice, really, because they didn't have to release me from my contract. They could have just buried the manuscript forever or delayed the publication so long it became irrelevant. So I called Seymour Hersh, and he put the story on the front page of the New York Times. And that checked the CIA's capacity to suppress the book. When they delivered their report 10 days later, I was surprised at how little criticism they had of my findings. Apparently, she took it as a kind of an endorsement of the accuracy. In other words, I'd written a critical analysis of CIA operations. The agency reviewed it and found that the legal department of Harper and Row looked at the CIA's report, looked at my notes, and decided that there didn't need to be a single word of change in my manuscript. But in the process, what I discovered was how deeply the CIA had penetrated American society. I later found out that there was an FBI phone tap. I got an IRS, that's the Internal Revenue Service, part of the Inland Revenue in the United Kingdom. They audited my income, even though I had a poverty level graduate student income. And then in the mountains of Laos, where I mentioned hiking into the mountains of Laos and doing that opium survey in a village where I got ambushed, the village headman who had been my host, a CIA helicopter landed in that village, put the headman on the helicopter, and as they took off, pointed out to the headman how long it was to the ground. And then the headman did what he had to do. He lied and denied everything. So, all made up, he said, no truth to any of it. So what stunned me was, the capacity of the CIA to just reach into so many aspects of American society to put this pressure on me. Oh, yeah, and I left out people from the Health Education Welfare Department. Now the Department of Education turned up at Yale to investigate my graduate fellowship, and I was put on probation by my university for not taking some of my graduate exams on time. In other words, just the way they could pull strings, the depth of influence, the depth of the penetration of American society, an indelible experience. It seems all wry now, but the pressure on me was so acute. I'm a stable person, right? The only time I've ever contemplated extinction or just wanting to die was then, when the pressure was built. It's the only time in my life, okay?
Yeah.
And you read about the kinds of pressures that get put on people in authoritarian societies when the state begins to squeeze them, okay? That happened to me. And when I say they had these deeply embedded ties, I mean, I felt like the life was being squeezed out of me. It was, there was one afternoon, where I was just lying face down on a bed, and I couldn't move. I was completely paralyzed. I was utterly demoralized, and I was contemplating, my extinction. I didn't go through ideation, but it was just that bad. Fortunately, a friend who lived downstairs knocked on my door and invited me to dinner with him and his wife, and we had a lovely chat and a glass of wine, and everything felt better by the end of the dinner. But there was a long afternoon of just feeling this relentless pressure on me, just squeezing me, suffocating, squeezing the life out of me.
Yeah.
And so, it seems unimaginable now, but back then, the apparatus of power was deeply embedded in the society and could do things like that.
I want to come back to I think it really is an absolutely extraordinary story, and a really remarkable testament to your perseverance through that, and significantly extraordinary productivity given the difficulties of those events. I want to kind of zoom out now, because we've focused on some of those stories of the Cold War, your own, those in Vietnam. I want to come back to one of the kind of the frameworks that you use in your book, one of your 4 frameworks, and that is geopolitics. And this is kind of used, I think, quite colloquially, but you actually root it in quite a specific discourse that starts, or at least has a major opponent in this man, Halford Mackinder, who's or Sir Halford Mackinder even, who is a British geographer. And people can see on the map here that he has this idea that there is a sort of a way of dividing up the world to describe what it is, the areas of the world that are particularly important for the practice of geopolitics. And I think in our world of sort of massive interconnectivity, these kinds of spatial distinctions can seem anachronistic. They can seem sort of passé in some ways. And I'd like you to kind of motivate, like, why is it that we should still pay attention to this way of dividing up the world when it seems like lots of the sort of spatial distances have been, destroyed by technology?
Because empires rise and fall, empires come and go, and geography is more or less forever. Okay, so there are underlying geopolitical threads you can say. All right, let's juxtapose 2 crises. Okay, first of all, Mackinder's theory was supplemented by the work of an American geopolitical theorist named Nicholas Spikeman, who wrote during the 1930s and 1940s. In many ways, he improved upon Mackinder's theory. Mackinder's prose is almost Victorianly opaque. It's difficult to figure out exactly what he's saying, which is why I think he survived as an influential figure for so long, because he's sort of a vessel into which you can pour your own ideas. Spikeman very importantly, well, first of all, to go back to Mackinder boiled down his axiom. He's first of all defined this tricontinental formation of Europe, Asia, and Africa. He called it the world island. And then he said that there's this pivot area, or he also called that the heartland. And in 1919, at the end of World War I, he sort of summarized all of his ideas in a memorable maxim, which was, he who rules the heartland rules Eurasia, and he who rules Eurasia rules the world, right? And embedded with that, in that idea, is that Eurasia is the epicenter of global power. And you can see the way he's drawn the map, okay? There are these outlying islands like Greenland and North America and South America and Australia, all right? And so to be dominant, to be a global hegemon, you have to contend for power in Eurasia. And then if you can see this in that map, there is the inner or marginal crescent. Now, Spikeman, in his theory, relabeled that. He called that the rimland, or the zone of conflict. And it's stretching basically from Poland through the Middle East, across Southeast Asia, basically up to the Korean Peninsula. And when you think about the Cold War, okay, all of the major conflicts of the Cold War generally occurred along that zone of conflict. The Korean War, the Vietnam War. There were 4 wars in the Middle East. There was the Greek Civil War. That's where much of the conflicts occurred. When there were other conflicts in Africa and Central America, but the bulk of the fighting occurred along that rimline. The U.S. strategy for winning the Cold War was very clear. Now, it seems odd when we have such, ill-informed leaders in Washington today. But in the immediate post-World War II era, America's leaders, often military men like the U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall, the U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, or the Commissioner for Germany, Lucius Clary, one can go on. These were American military officers, Allied military officers, that for 4 years, from their morning coffee to their bourbon nightcap, for 4 years, they drank the elixir of geopolitics. What they were trying to do in the war, in this massive global war, was dislodge the Axis powers from the eastern end of Eurasia, China, Manchuria, and Japan, and Southeast Asia, and then the western axial end of Eurasia, the Axis powers in, the Nazi Empire and continental Europe and its Italian adjunct, okay? And so the whole war was a geopolitical exercise for capturing the Eurasian landmass from the Axis powers. And so when the Cold War started, George Kennan, the top US diplomat and Soviet specialist, devised what he called the containment strategy. And this strategy of containment essentially started off with an Iron Curtain going down the heart of Europe from the Baltic Sea to the Balkans. And then with the Chinese Revolution in 1949, it extended all the way across the Eurasian landmass. Now, the US strategy for fighting and winning the Cold War, and we did win hands down, was essentially a geopolitical strategy, all right? We drew that Iron Curtain across the Eurasian landmass, and then we encircled that with rings of steel. First of all, military alliances, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Europe, the Middle Eastern Treaty Organization, which stretched from Turkey to Pakistan, then CETO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which also included Pakistan and stretched to Southeast Asia. And then there were at the time, 5 bilateral military pacts with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Australia. It was originally Australia and New Zealand, but New Zealand dropped out. So 5 down. And then on top of that, we had, by 1955, 500 bases, basically air bases, ringing the Eurasian landmass. And ultimately, we had 3 great fleets, the 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean, the 5th Fleet in the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea, and the 7th Fleet in the bulk of the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Western Pacific. We ringed the Eurasian landmass with these circles of steel, and then whenever the Soviets tried to venture out, they tried to venture out in Korea, that was the Korean War. They ventured out attacking South Vietnam from North Vietnam. That was the Vietnam War. But most often, when they ventured out, we sent these men on the spot, these covert operatives, to counter the CIA intervention. So let's take Afghanistan. In 1979, the Russians sent 100,000 troops to occupy Afghanistan. And Washington sent one man, CIA operative Howard Hart, and they sent him to Islamabad undercover in the embassy, and he would drive himself up to the bazaar in Peshawar in the northwest frontier province of Pakistan, and he worked with the top Mujahideen commanders, and with his multi-million-dollar budget, provided them with arms. And by the time he left in 1983, he had organized a Mujahideen army of about 250,000 men. And for 10 years, that Mujahideen army fought and bloodied the Red Army in Afghanistan. And they came across the Friendship Bridge, the last Russian tanks, in February of 1989, into the Soviet Union, bloodied, battered, and utterly demoralized. Just ripped the guts out of the Red Army. And, that's February 1989. Well, the autumn revolutions in Europe were October, November. Now, up to this time, whether it was Budapest in 1956 or Prague in 1968, when the East Europeans rose in revolt against the Soviet client regimes, the Red Army's tanks rolled and crushed. And this time, the Red Army didn't roll. Yeah, a few tanks came out in Lithuania, but basically, it was so eviscerated that the Red Army could no longer serve as instrument of repression. Eastern Europe rose in revolt. The Soviet satellites in that bordering Eastern Europe followed. The Baltic states broke free. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine broke free. So did Belarus, and the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War was over. Yeah. And so that geopolitical strategy for fighting and winning the Cold War was brilliantly successful. It was extraordinarily successful. And so I would argue that geopolitics played a determinative effect, and that even in the post-war Cold War era, we can see the continuity in geopolitics. If you want, we can discuss the geopolitical continuities between Suez and Hormuz.
There was this open question at the moment about whether or not we are entering a new Cold War. Maybe we've been in a Cold War for a while, but I do think there is a kind of deep continuity between the thing that founders the British Empire, which is the Suez Crisis of 1956, and exactly what you're saying here, which is the current crisis in the Strait of Hormuz.
All right, geopolitically. In this wide world of ours, there are only 7 major maritime choke points. That hasn't changed, all right? Hasn't changed since the ancient Greeks. Their loss of control of one of those choke points was the death of Athens, all right? So they have been important in history for several thousand years, all right? Now, in the Middle East, there are 2 choke points, Suez and Straits of Hormuz. In July of 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal, which to that time had been British ownership, and he absolutely outraged the British. I believe Sir Anthony Eden convened a cabinet meeting at 4 a.m. at 10 Downing Street and ordered assassination attempts against Nasser, all of which failed. And then, since assassination failed, the Eden government had a secret meeting near Paris with the Israelis and the French, and they organized a 2-stage operation. And so in October of 1956, a massive imperial armada of 6 aircraft carriers, British and French, appeared off the shores of Egypt. And in the first week of war, the Anglo-French forces destroyed the Egyptian Air Force, shot down 100 aircraft, including most of the new Egyptian Soviet MiGs. And in the sands of the Sinai Desert, the Israeli Defense Forces destroyed the bulk of Egypt's armor, most of its tanks. And so in the first week of war, Egypt had lost all of its strategic forces, land and air, and seemed to be completely defeated and powerless before the might of this imperial juggernaut. But Nasser recalled the geopolitics that the British had seemingly forgotten. He got a couple of dozen rusting freighters and filled them with rocks and sank them at the north end of the Suez Canal. And by the time the British and French commando forces came storming ashore at the north end of the canal, their objective had been snatched from their grasp. The canal was closed. And a couple months later, when the British withdrew in defeat from Suez, they had been sanctioned by the UN. The British pound sterling, which had once been the world's global reserve currency, required an IMF bailout. The first IMF bailout was not for the Mexican peso, it was for the British pound. The aura of British power had evaporated. Suddenly, the limits of British power were transparent for the whole world to see. And the British Empire was essentially on basically about a 10-year road to utter extinction. Let's now turn to the contemporary, February 28th or whatever it was, massive U.S. Armada in the Arabian Sea, and the terrible swift sword of American air power destroys the top command of Iran, kills Ayatollah Khamenei, wipes out many of their missile launchers, attacks their air bases, and is so cripples Iran's air defenses, which were already damaged last year, that the U.S. and Israeli Air Force can almost fly unimpeded across the whole of Iran. Iran seems to be, once again, powerless before a latter-day American imperial juggernaut. And so what do? They just took their cheap $20,000 a copy Shahed drones and they started firing at them. They hit 5 ships in the Persian Gulf. They started hitting oil and gas refineries on the south shore of the Persian Gulf, and they closed the Straits of Hormuz. Here's my prediction, okay? I think that, on the surface, this massive Israeli-American air attack on Iran, striking wherever they will, at whatever they might will, looks like Iran is fundamentally defeated. But because of the underlying geopolitics, from a geostrategic perspective, Iran has already won the war. Okay? Why? Because we've smashed most of the prime targets. The Trump administration claims, the U.S. Defense Department says that they've taken out all the significant military targets, right? So we've done what we can do. Sure, we can bomb the rubble. We can, hit the electrical plants. We can start, bombing daycare centers and universities and mosques, turn whole cities to rubble. Well, sure, we can start doing that. But basically, we've done what we can do. But that's on the north side of the Persian Gulf. That's the Iran side. But on the south side of the Persian Gulf, there is a whole world of targets. These sprawling natural gas plants and oil fields. If you look at them, look at any aerial photograph, they're like an erector set of tanks and pipes, and they're all carrying the most volatile fluids on the planet. They're not hardened, any one of them. And, any Shahed drone, can barely miss. All you do is hit them and they all explode into flames. They have many targets. They have a world of targets yet to strike, and we don't have any. Okay, it's the same thing with Nasser. It's the same strategy, right? Powerless, right? He took out the Suez Canal. And so what it means is that in an asymmetric war like this, with the geopolitics whispering in the ear of history, the way it works is that all of the weaker power has to do is to absorb the hit and then wait it out, because they're only responsible for essentially preserving their own regime, whereas the dominant world powers are responsible for running the whole world. And so the disruption of the world economy redounds to the discredit and disrupts the hegemonic powers, whereas the regional powers, all they have to do is just survive. As Nasser did, and as the current theocratic regime in Iran looks like they're going to do.
From the American perspective, it seems like this is, in some ways, the dying gasp of a particular petrochemical regime. The energy system of the US empire has been coal and oil and natural gas for a very long time. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about this kind of transition between global orders and what the unspooling of the American empire and the American global order might mean for the rise of China and indeed the kinds of energy that it is increasingly relying on, which are solar, wind, hydropower, renewables of other sorts, and nuclear, of course.
Just as Suez precipitated, didn't cause, but it precipitated an evaporation, a very rapid evaporation of British global power. So I think the Straits of Hormuz is precipitating a slower erosion of U.S. global hegemony. The American system is far larger, far more embedded in the world order than the British system was, although the British system was deeply embedded, no doubt. But the American system is that much stronger, and its unraveling will correspondingly take longer time and be more complicated. All right. But the consequence is the same. And I think there are three causal factors that are precipitating this erosion of U.S. global power, which we're seeing in the Straits of Hormuz. Okay, the one is a geopolitical shift. Okay, that I said during the Cold War, the key to the United States victory was recognizing the centrality of Eurasia to global power. That Eurasia was the epicenter of global power, and the U.S. containment strategy involved basically dominating Eurasia. Well, if you read the national security strategy written by the Trump administration and published in November of last year, they talk about withdrawing from the world and concentrating U.S. forces in the Western Hemisphere. This is basically a kind of a unilateral retreat from Eurasia, and it's certainly ongoing. There are all kinds of measurements of it that we could go into, but I think it's safe to say that's ongoing. So that's one thing, is this gross geopolitical miscalculation by an administration that has very little sense of how the global system operates, very little sense of geopolitics. A second a key factor, I think, is the energy transition that's ongoing. For the past 500 years, every ascendant imperial power, every ascendant global hegemon has had their rise synonymous with a significant innovation in energy. Okay, Portugal and Spain, it was not only the mastery of the winds in the Portuguese caravel, which had the ability to tack, because of the triangular sails, to tack into the winds, not just being blown before the winds, and then being forced to row like Mediterranean galleys, or if you want to go in the wind. I mean, that was one thing, was a first step to the mastery of the winds. More fundamentally, was at Sao Tome in the Gulf of Guinea off the west coast of Africa, the Portuguese developed the slave plantation. And this represented a maximization of the energy output of the human body. In the temperate climate of Europe, farmers could only work 6 months a year. And they tended to be, by the 14th, 15th century, independent yeoman farmers, freed from the manse or the manor, right? The Portuguese slave plantation on the island of Sao Tome, dragooned enslaved Africans, worked them 12 months a year, 12 hours a day minimum, right? And worked them to the brink of death and beyond. That was about a 15% loss of labor on most of the Caribbean slave plantations. And so they maximized the energy output of the human body, and they produced a form of agriculture that was so extraordinarily profitable that, unlike most economic systems that simply are superseded and fade, this was one that was so profoundly and persistently profitable, right? The very famous study of slavery in the United States called Time on the Cross calculated that the southern slave plantation was 35% more efficient than the northern independently owned farm. Okay, and this system was so profitable that slavery had to be killed. The Royal Navy had to mount an operation that lasted 75 years in order to extirpate the Atlantic slave trade. The United States had to fight a bloody civil war and lose 700,000 lives to wipe out the southern slave plantation. This was a persistently profitable system. So that was the Portuguese and the Spanish. The next major world power were the Dutch, and they mastered the winds. At Zaan, which is an area near Amsterdam, the Dutch created the world's first industrial zone. They had about 150 windmills with that operated as sawmills, and the average windmill could turn 60 logs a day into uniform planks for the construction of a new form of ship, the flute ship, that required fewer sailors and carried 10 times the cargo of a Portuguese caravel. And through this mastery of the winds, the Dutch built a global empire that stretched from the Spice Islands of Indonesia to the island of Manhattan in North America. The next, of course, was the British. James Watt, in the late 18th century, invents the steam engine. By the early decades of the 19th century, British engineers have come up with ways of microscaling the steam engine to put it aboard ships and to put it on railroads. And the age of steam and steel was with us, and that's what carried Great Britain to building a great global empire. And then, synonymous with the rise of America, coal and steam remained the dominant source of power in the American economy till 1950. And it was then that petroleum and gasoline began to replace coal and steam as the dominant mode of power for the American economy. Indeed, the global economy. And so that was what propelled the American world system was oil, which is why we're obsessed with the Middle East and all that. It's, the Persian Gulf has 50% of the world's oil reserves. Now, what we're witnessing right now is a fundamental revolution in energy, equivalent to the British Industrial Revolution. It's of that scale. It's that profound. It's that important. China is mastering alternative energy, green energy. The internal combustion engine, as an engineering object, has basically maximized its potential. There's not much you can do with the internal combustion engine anymore. But the electrical vehicle is basically a steel box with a battery. And there are ongoing innovations in battery technology. All right. When electric vehicles hit the US market, there were three problems that constrained it. One, the number of cycles, the number of times you could recharge the battery before it wore out. Second, the time it took to charge the battery to full, right? It took hours and hours. And then the problem was, I live in Wisconsin, which is the upper Midwest. We have, even these days, this winter, we had a week when it was, minus 10 Fahrenheit, and when it's cold, like all batteries, they lose about half their power. My friends that have Teslas in Wisconsin, their driving range goes down from 300 miles to maybe 120 miles, right? So the Chinese have solved all the problems, right? They now have batteries that charge in 5 minutes. They have production batteries. The Neo has a battery that has a 600-mile range on a single charge, and they've beaten the problem of cold. The Chinese have solved all the technical problems of the battery, and that's just the first step. And there are, right now, the materials are a bit costly. There are engineers working on alternative cheap materials, okay? So what we're seeing is ongoing, and mind you, let's take, one of the most successful Chinese automobile companies, Xiaomi. One of the Xiaomi, the top-end model, now has the world's, for production car, on the track in Germany, has set the world's speed record. The Xiaomi is faster than a Porsche. They can do 330 miles an hour with an electrical vehicle. And 5 years ago, Xiaomi was a computer company that didn't make any cars at all. Okay, so this is a revolution that is developing speed far beyond what it took the Industrial Revolution to spread. Already, because of breakthroughs in solar panels, electricity generated by solar panels is 41% cheaper than the lowest cost carbon fuel source. And energy generated by wind turbines is over 50% cheaper. Okay? So we're in the midst of a transformation of energy. Once we develop really cheap batteries, and there are already people that are building, and we have battery storage farms attached to solar panels and wind turbines, then that deals with the erratic nature. Solar panels only charge during sunlight, and so there's a long dark night. Turbines only charge when the wind blows, but the storage batteries even that out, right? And so we're right at the cusp of a transformation of the world's energy, and China is doing that. And the Trump administration is using the power of the American state to stifle, to smother America's infinite energy revolution in its cradle. The Biden administration invested about $1 trillion in launching a green revolution in the United States, and the Trump administration has done everything in its power to dismantle it in every way possible. It's extraordinary. It's the equivalent of, let's say, instead of building the Transcontinental Railroad and opening it in the 1860s, as if the United States had decided, you know what? Canals, barge canals are the future. We're going to build the Trans-Rocky Mountain Barge Canal, right?
Yeah.
Okay. if Britain had decided, no, we're going to ban, railroads, and we're going to have a national horse breeding program,
Yeah.
I mean, it's a travesty. It's an absolute travesty.
There's that Henry Ford quote, right? If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And I feel like there's a kind of there's a trap there in the current American administration for sure. I did want to ask one more question about the sort of prospective Chinese world order. It sounds very intimidating, perhaps, but maybe not for everyone. Which is that you specified earlier that as new world orders come into being, they also bring in a new moral framework. And I think there are lots of perhaps sort of spooky ideas people might have about what that moral framework will be in a Chinese world order. But it seems to me from observing the Chinese state that they are principally interested in trade, calmness, regularity, order, business, essentially. They're not a very erratic state. They plan in 5-year time horizons and so on. What kind of things do you think we can expect as a kind of international relations order if China accelerates its tendency, which is already on, to become the hegemonic global actor?
First of all, the Trump administration is not only smothering America's energy revolution, it's also liquidating the more benign and humanistic and idealistic aspects of U.S. global power. During the U.S. era of hegemony, the number of people living in absolute poverty has dropped very markedly. And during the Cold War, of course, all agencies, including humanitarian agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development or USAID, were instruments of Cold War policy. They served U.S. interests in a quite explicit way. Their humanitarian mission was subordinated to their hegemonic mission. But once the Cold War was over in 1991, and the U.S. was a unipolar power, USAID changed. It was already in transition, but it changed to become a really effective global humanitarian organization. And there are calculations that as many as 20 million people may die in the next couple of years because USAID has cut out its support, for example, retroviral drugs for people that are infected with AIDS in Africa and such. They've canceled their food and feeding programs. So the Trump administration, during its first months in office, when you look back at what they've accomplished, with Elon Musk and the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, they tried to cut the National Institute of Health. Well, Congress has actually now increased the funding for the National Institute of Health. About the only thing that really got cut permanently was USAID, and it's gone. And it's going to be very difficult to rebuild a successor agency. So the United States has already, under Trump, liquidated the more idealistic aspects of the U.S. world order, which were basically, you could summarize that as tremendous support for the least of the least to have a chance for development, right? Through aid, not loans. And second, humanitarian relief programs to support the poorest of the poor in refugee camps at times of crisis, to help them get through these difficult transitions and then survive and maybe even in the due course of time prosper. A system of international law promoting human rights. Remember I said that, when the UN Charter was established, there were 2 core principles. Everybody on the planet had human rights, and every people deserved their own state, and that state should be guaranteed inviolable sovereignty. Okay. So in the midst of the kind of realpolitik of U.S. hegemony, there was this consistent thread of idealism that was embedded in the international system that the United States created after World War II. We've begun to liquidate that quite markedly, quite dramatically, which means that the transition to the Chinese order, which I see as essentially a transactional order, right? It's loans, not aid, right? It's trade, not necessarily development. The human rights are deemed to be an inconsequential factor among states. The Chinese don't take cognizance of other nations' human rights violations, and they don't look favorably on other nations criticizing China's human rights performance. So it's a transactional world order grounded in trade and loan finance development. And I see it as not grounded in alliances, either bilateral or multilateral mutual security pacts. China doesn't do that. It's going to be a world, I think, a more fluid world, a multipolar world. In this, I think NATO will fade. I think the Greenland issue has made it pretty clear that to Europe that Europe has to develop its own military capacity, and Europe is moving in that direction. The cynicism by which the Trump administration has treated Ukraine, and the curious subordination to Putin's demands has, I think, taught the Europeans that they're going to be responsible for their own defense. Already we can see Japan rearming, which means Japan will become an more independent power. And what I think we're also going to see is something that we had during the Cold War. During the Cold War, it started off with just two powers with the bomb, Russia and the United States, or the Soviet Union and the United States. And then there was a limited proliferation. France, Britain, China acquired the bomb. South Africa probably developed it, but liquidated the program, and the Israelis developed it, and then India, and ultimately Pakistan. What we're going to do now, I think, is we're going to see a rapid nuclear proliferation. South Korea, I mean, look what happened during this current crisis. The United States had based THAAD missiles, which is our interceptors in South Korea. It pulled them out because the United States has got a shortage of interceptor missiles. And that makes it very clear to the South Koreans that they're responsible for their own defense. It's raising, I think, a serious debate in South Korea about whether or not South Korea, which certainly has the technological capacity to build a bomb very, very quickly. Should they build a bomb? Japan will next face it. And then they're going to be European powers. So the Germans have a bomb. The British and French in Europe have a bomb. What about, the Germans? They're the next one to build a bomb. They could do it. I mean, they almost did it during World War II. They could do it in a heartbeat. What about Italy? And so on. So we're going to see a world of, I think, nuclear proliferation. So it's not only going to be a multipolar world, but I think there's going to be a world of greater risk. Because when your rival powers like India and Pakistan get the bomb, then there's a greater possibility of existential crisis that would prompt one power or the other to use the bomb. So, it's going to be a changing world in many ways, I think, a more dangerous world. But let's not forget, I'm not a big fan of U.S. global hegemony, but I'm a student of empire, and I analyze them. I try to analyze them, what they did and what they didn't do. All right. And one thing about the U.S. system, is right at the dawn of the nuclear age, we dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That is our moral burden for eternity. All right. But during the Cold War, the superpowers, all of them were relatively responsible. They all developed nuclear arsenals, and they didn't use them. We did not have great power conflict, direct conflict during the whole of the Cold War and in the aftermath. Right. And that is in many ways a kind of extraordinary achievement. During the Cold War, you either had to have the weapons or you had to shelter through mutual defense treaties under somebody else who had the nuclear weapons. As that system erodes, then we're moving into this era that I'm calling of increased nuclear proliferation and the risk attendant upon it.
Just to sort of underlie one of the examples there that you gave, the India-Pakistan conflict, and its kind of geopolitical dimension, these are both powers that have that rely on and need the Indus River for different things. India for hydropower, Pakistan because it feeds and waters the Punjab region of Pakistan, which is the major crop growing region. That is an ineliminable fact, right? These are both powers that rely on this river for different things, and they both have nuclear weapons, and they have deep-seated political conflicts as well. Like that is a very dangerous situation already, and they are both nuclear armed powers. If you imagine proliferating several more of those conflicts, you can really imagine how much things might take off in quite an extreme manner. Alfred McCoy, thank you so much for doing your own research.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.